Okay, so one of the reasons why we're going to be using OpenCart in this course, again, that's why we're teaching it, is because it is built off the model view controller pattern. Again, that doesn't mean you can't use WooCommerce or another solution. We're looking for the best portfolio piece, but for the devs out there, understanding the MVC pattern is critical in getting employed in this field. Now, I'm going to show you real quick. I tend to do this sometimes where I look at the job market. And let's just go ahead and do MVC in San Diego, California. And here you can see the salaries and the vast number of jobs available. 95 right now. So where MVC is critical. So why is it critical? Because in modern web development, we have multiple people working on the same projects. There are people who are great at databasing. There are people who are great at intermediate or middleware, meaning PHP coders, and there are great front-end developers. So what the model view controller paradigm does, and which OpenCart does it great, is to separate these areas of where the code is so that no one overwrites each other. This coupled with subversion like GitHub means no one ever overwrites each other, but also everybody has their own domain to be controlled over, to control over. So this diagram is great. We're going to look at this diagram real quick, and I'm going to show you an example of a very, very small model view controller system. So basically the model, that's your data. In the case of e-commerce, it's your categories, it's your products, your images, your prices, all the things that are stored dynamically in a database, regardless of what technology is doing the storing, whether it's Mongo, SQL, any of them. So the model is your data. The view is literally what you see. The view is what we call the presentation layer. That's your HTML, your front-end code, JavaScript, jQuery, whatever you're using to deliver to the browser. Your controller is the intermediary script that will call the database and get what the user requests and then feed it to them. So in our case, it's usually PHP in this curriculum. When we start doing MeanStack in fall of 2019, we'll be doing that in the front end completely with the front end will become the back end. However, for our purposes here, OpenCart's a great introduction to it because it does it really well. I'm going to argue it does it far better than WordPress. WordPress has a little bit of confiscated architecture regarding its directories. Okay, so model view controller. So a lot of times, if you're in this program, you're thinking about where do I fit in this scenario. Well, you might be a great big database person, then you might be the model person. You might be a controller, then you're the PHP guy. And if this is the case, then you're JavaScript and HTML and CSS3. So let's move forward. I want to go and show you it's basically an application called Tiny MVC, and I've actually taken the original Tiny MVC and reduced it to its lowest common denominator. Okay, so remember, it's model view controller. This is your application, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the code to this video, and we're going to go ahead and just look at it. Okay, so this is the Tiny MVC EX. So when we look at something, what do we normally look at? Well, we usually look at the home page or the index page, right? And in this case, there's my home page. So this is turning on errors, and this is requiring the file that's in the application directory, and it's named TinyMVC. So let's look at that. I'm going to open up TinyMVC real quick, and look at this. This doesn't do anything but require 3 different scripts. Now, if you've had WebD 166, that's where we cover object-oriented PHP the most. If you've had 153, we use an object-oriented system to control our database, which is called PDO, or PHP Data Objects. Either way, don't get scared by this. It was created to make things easier, to make PHP easier to understand. So what this TinyMVC is doing, which is required by the index, is simply creating a new instance of the controller. Remember, the controller is what contacts the model and grabs the data from the model and presents it to the view. So he's the guy in the middle. He's sort of like think of him as a bouncer at a nightclub, and the nightclub's the model and the user's the view. He's the intermediary. He can let you in or let you out. He can show you what he wants to show you. That's it. Okay? So when you see these requires, you can take these in order. Like load, for example. Well, I'm going to go ahead and copy this because requiring load.php simply means to get that value. So what this load does is exactly what it says. It loads as an object a view if it knows its file name and if it needs data. So what we're saying here is, okay, if the data that gets sent as an argument happens to be an array, we'll extract it. And guess what? The data that got extracted is literally this. And if I look at my source code, it's relatively simple, but it's just that. Okay? So that, I'm going to shut this before I confuse anyone else, but that is the load. Oh, what's the model? Well, the model is always the supplier of data, right? And if you're in this program toward the end of it, you're probably familiar with SQL and MySQL, and that's usually our data provider, right? In this case, it's just an array. I've returned this array because if you recall, when you call an SQL database, generally the data that comes out is an object, but it's an array or an associative array. So I'm skipping that whole database side of it. And now I've acquired the model. And there's the array. Lastly, I'm requiring this controller. So let's paste that. I'm going to look at right here. So there's the controller. So what does this controller do? Well, it makes the variables load and model public. Well, that's so that we can have access to this class and this class. So now they're both publicly available. Next, I have a constructor. A constructor in PHP will run the second controller is created as a new instance. It runs automatically without being called. And all we're doing here is saying that, hey, this class, make it equal to the value load equal to new load and make the model equal to new model. And then this will determine what page we're on. So I'm basically saying, in this class, call this function. This function has a variable called data that calls this model user info. So guess what? Since this model is equal to new model, well, we have to look for user info, and there it is. So we're saying, hey, data equals this, the model, and this function. And this function does nothing but return the data. Okay, and now I can load the view. So this load would call the view function, which is right here, and pass the name to it. And that name is SumView.php. So guess what? SumView.php is going to be loaded into this value and will include the views with that section. And this is exactly the HTML. So what you've just witnessed is the smallest model view controller scenario ever. I can't think of reducing it any further, but it's one I'm going to zip. And I'm also going to end this video right now. And what I'm going to do is create a video in OpenCart for those of you who are seeing this from the e-commerce class. And OpenCart, we're going to draw parallels between what you see here and what's in OpenCart. So I bid you adieu.